So one other thing that I was quite curious about. So you mentioned literalism, I think, first in the beginning of our conversation with
Right.
regard actually to epistemology or what knowledge is. And then it became relevant to our philosophy of art and then also just objects in general. And another term that I noticed in your writing used often that I'm familiar with actually in the philosophy of mathematics, which just goes to show my point, which is that it takes on very different meanings in different contexts. And that's this word formalism.
Hmm.
And I'm wondering how formalism or what formalism means, particularly in the context of architecture and the philosophy of the same.
The way I use it is in the Kantian sense. And as far as I'm aware, Kant only uses it in his ethics. He does call his ethics a formalism because it's abstracted from any specific principles. The fact that an ethical action simply has to be done in such a way that it could become a universal law, and then it has variants such as people must be treated as ends, not as means. But then this term formalism has come into aesthetics. Kant does not use that in the Critique of Judgment, as far as I'm aware, but he is considered the godfather of aesthetic formalism, and rightly so. And the way he means formalism is that something has an autonomy, that it's disconnected from its context. So in ethics, a formalistic ethics is one that's not consequentialist. It's disconnected from any consideration of what the consequences are. In arts, what Kant means by formalism is the idea that art is disconnected from the way it, whether or not it makes us feel agreeable, whether or not it pleases me. To see a movie like Field of Dreams about my home state, Iowa, is irrelevant to discussing the aesthetic merit of Field of Dreams as a cinematic piece. Also, the fact that the artwork and the beholder, as Michael Fried calls it, are disconnected from each other somehow, even though for Kant, it's the beholder that's more important. It's the subject that's more important than the art object. Because for him, art is ultimately about the conditions by which the subject encounters it. There's still that separation between the work and the beholder. And so this is what I mean by formalism. I mean a kind of de-relational sense. In mathematics, it's very different, of course. Just like realism can mean different things in different contexts.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Formalism for me means something that's autonomous, something that is decontextualized, derelationized. And what it has meant in architecture, it's been a 20th century term, and originally it meant formalism as opposed to functionalism, I guess, right? Because functionalism was seen as kind of the core of modern architecture, that you're not trying to decorate a building with ornate historical styles. Its look is simply supposed to express what it does. And of course, the critique has been made that that was never true because something like streamlining buildings wasn't always necessary, and yet streamlining became kind of the standard look of modernism. And so you'd have a streamlined look to your buildings just to telegraph that it's a modernistic building, even though that wasn't needed, even though it wasn't really functional in all cases, except maybe on tall skyscrapers that had wind shear and things. You don't really need streamlined motorhomes and things like that, but people do it because it looks modern. So someone like Peter Eisenman, who's most closely associated with formalism, Peter Eisenman wanted buildings to be self-contained, just like Kant did. And so what that meant for him is that buildings shouldn't be humanistic, because like Kant wanted to separate the work from the human who was enjoying it or appreciating it. Eisenman wanted to do the same thing. So I think in a way there's something a little retrograde about that. I argue with Eisenman in my book. He's very much been the thinking person's architect for a few decades, but I disagree with him on some things, and this is one of them. He thinks the architectural work shouldn't really have a function as a primary goal. In fact, he sometimes deliberately makes his buildings non-functional for that very reason. He has cases where he has a column going down the middle of the master bed or down the middle of the dining table, which he says, hey, it makes people think more. Or in the case of the Wexner Center at Ohio State University, he had paintings in direct sunlight in the gallery that people complained about. So sometimes he deliberately makes his buildings non-functional. But what it's really more about is that he wants the building to be like a text in Derrida's sense, like something that you're looking at that provides the clues for how to read it. And so one example is he takes a famous building by Le Corbusier that has columns inside, And he notices brilliantly that the columns are closer to the back wall than they are to the side wall. There's more space on the sides than the back. And so he says what he thinks Le Corbusier is trying to do is to invite us to imagine the building being extended in depth, but not in breadth. Because it's as if the columns are pushing against the back wall, but they're not pressuring against the side walls because they're not that close to it. And he goes through and gives a series of brilliant readings of buildings using that principle. My problem with that is I agree with those who don't think you can have non-functional buildings. I think you get sculpture if you do that. And that's not what
Ah,
architecture is. I think you
yeah.
need a function. And I don't think function is as dangerous to formalism as Liseman thinks it is. I think you can still have a formalist function, although that sounds paradoxical. All you need is a derelationized function. You need a function that's detached enough from its specific function that an aesthetic gap is created there. So in the cases of monuments that Rossi talked about, or in the case of Sci-Arc, where the fact that you have this old historical meaning of a freight rail depot still there in tension with its current architectural usage, architecture school usage, creates a kind of interesting gap between the function and the specific use that it has here and now. That, for me, is an example of a good function, a derelationized function in architecture. And I think if architects don't do that, they're missing an opportunity. They're missing an opportunity to aestheticize the function as well as the form of the building, rather than leaving it literal.
Now, something you said that I just want to clarify is the distinction then in your terminology between statue and architecture just the role of function in architecture that is lacking in a statue?
Yes. I guess you could say both a piece of architecture and a sculpture could be site specific, because some artists do say their sculpture is site specific. But when you talk about a site specific culture, you're talking more about sculpture. You're talking more about a sculpture that interacts with other parts of the environment, like a river or something, and there's an interplay between those. The human is not really invited into that interplay, except in the derivative sense of a beholder. Whereas in architecture, the human is invited into undertaking activities or inhabiting a space. And so I think that's the difference. And there might be borderline cases where you can't really tell whether something's sculpture or architecture. But at the end of the day, things fall into those two categories pretty clearly. It's one or the other.
Hmm. And I guess in line with this direction of inquiry, is there a clear connection between architecture and art? Like, do you view architecture as just a species of art, the way that statues or sculptures or performance or painting are just all fall under this maybe loose genus that we can't give necessary and sufficient conditions for?
I would say architecture has to derelationize function in a way that art does not, unless we're talking about design. And then design's already closer to architecture anyway. So if you've got some of my favorite artworks at the Met in New York are the suits of armor, which obviously had a function as well.
Right.
So those are already almost closer to architecture because they fall under design, not so much under visual art. In a way, visual art strips away the functional character much more so than you'd find in cases of design.
Hmm.
And
The Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that regarding your question about architecture not failing to be one of the most important themes for philosophy, what I would say is that throughout the history of aesthetics, there's usually been one genre of art taking the lead with philosophers. So sometimes it's literature. It's in Aristotle's case, it was Greek tragedy. In Nietzsche's case, again, maybe Greek tragedy, but also opera because he was thinking about Wagner. And then you have literary periods, music like in Schopenhauer. And I made the case that it should be architecture now, precisely because I think we're starting to see the failure of Kantian formalism in aesthetic theory, precisely because you can't disentangle the beholder from the artwork anyway. And architects have already been forced to deal with this because in architecture, there's really no way at all to disentangle the human user from the work. And so I think, in a way, architectural aesthetic writing is better equipped to take us to where we need to go right now, which is to try to figure out how humans are entangled with aesthetic works at all times.
Hmm. Now, the Well, you mentioned the suits of armor at the Met, and
Mhm.
those also happen to be my favorite works of art at the Met. And
Oh, wow.
they're yeah, they're my favorite works of art at the Art Institute of Chicago too. I don't know why,
Mhm.
but I like fantasy writing and things like that a lot as well. But do you have any insight into why the suits of armor would be your favorite pieces of art at an art museum when they weren't even well, they have this design element to begin with, but they weren't just pure art objects. They, as you said, they have a function. Why have all those things? I mean, this is a question particular to you. Why they'd be your favorites?
Well, you mentioned fantasy writing, and I think that's actually part of it. That I talk about derelationizing things, and history, in a way, is one way of derelationizing things. The fact that suits of armor are no longer a part of our everyday worlds. They don't really have a utilitarian function now. They have more a literary and aesthetic function already. So you come to suits of armor with your aesthetic eyes already open, in a sense. Whereas if it were the Met had an exhibit of beautiful U.S. Army uniforms, something like that, or astronaut uniforms, you might have to perform a kind of complicated mental maneuver to view those purely in aesthetic terms. Or older cars are easier to view in aesthetic terms than 2023 model cars for
Right,
the
right.
same reason, because they're more on the functional side when they're 2023. Whereas 1950s cars are so much more fun to look at because they no longer seem functional.
Hmm.
It's amazing that you also like the suits of armor the best. You're the first person I've met who said that.
Uh-huh.
I used to go to the Met for the paintings, and then one day I just found myself captured in the suit of armor room, and it's never been the same since.
Hmm.
Or oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I mean, that is very insightful of you. That we are. I'd never thought of that before. That with regard to the cars in particular, that we see old cars and we perceive them much more. We perceive the aesthetic dimension much more readily than we would with uh, current models. But I remember even as a kid, I grew up in Chicago, so we would go to the Art Institute occasionally for field trips, and
Mm-hmm.
I was always just uh, obsessed with the suits of armor. I always thought they were so cool. That's I don't know. Did you watch A Song of Ice and Fire? I mean Game of Thrones.
No, because I don't have HBO, but I can't wait till it's on Netflix.
Yeah, I don't know if that's ever going to happen,
No, not.
but I mean, one of the things that I love so much about that show is the costume design, the suits of armor, the sigils,
Yes.
this sort of thing.
But we just finished rewatching the Lord of the Rings films and certainly enjoyed that.
Hmm.
Or if you go to a place like Dubrovnik, Croatia, where a lot of Game of Thrones was filmed, you have that immediate aesthetic reaction because it seems like a city from another place, like some other cities. Venice is another. You can't undertake a normal day of life in Venice. It feels like you're in a magic world. So something about the past automatically aestheticizes. And
Hmm.
it doesn't have to be that far back, right? Mad Men has the same effect on some people. Ironically, especially those who lived during that time in a way that I didn't, 1950s and 60s. My mother is drunk on that show watching it. Not even so much for the visuals as for the different rules that existed. Like she talks about watching kids play in the plastic thing from the dry cleaner, which you would never let your kids do now because it would
Right.
suffocate you, right? Or people having a picnic and just dumping the trash on the ground and leaving after the picnic, something you would never do now. There's something aesthetic about those differences as well.